There are documents that should never have been found, papers that reveal truths so disturbing they were hidden not by accident, but by deliberate design. This is the account of one such document, a ledger that remained concealed for nearly a century within the walls of a crumbling mansion in the heart of Mississippi. When it finally came to light in 1952, it exposed a system so meticulously planned and executed that it challenged everything we thought we knew about the period immediately following abolition. The pages contained not just numbers. They contained names, dates, and codes that, once deciphered, revealed what truly happened to thousands of people who believed they had won their freedom. This is the story of how that book was discovered, what it contained, and why some people went to extraordinary lengths to ensure it would never be read. Thomas Whitfield was 28 years old when he accepted the position of assistant archivist at the Mississippi Historical Society in April 1952. A history graduate from Boston University, he had spent the previous 3 years cataloging Civil War documents in northern libraries, meticulous but relatively quiet work. The offer to come south arrived unexpectedly, a brief telegram from a man named Dr. Harold Vance, director of the society, seeking someone with experience in preserving antique documents. The salary was unremarkable, but the opportunity intrigued him. Thomas had always felt that the true history of the South after the war remained partially untold, obscured by official narratives and selective memories. His own grandfather had fought for the Union, returning home with stories that never quite matched the triumphant narrative of preserved Union and delivered freedom. There were gaps in the history, shadows that the textbooks didn't adequately illuminate. Thomas had built his academic career around exploring those shadows. He accepted the position, and 2 weeks later found himself driving down red dirt roads beneath the humid heat of Mississippi. The journey from Boston had taken 3 days. He drove through Virginia, where battlefields had been turned into memorial parks with neat markers and preserved cannons. Through North Carolina, where spring was giving way to early summer. Through South Carolina, where Charleston's elegant decay spoke of a world that had collapsed less than a century before. Mississippi was different. The weight of history felt heavier here, more present. Small towns with faded storefronts lined the highways. Cotton fields stretched to the horizon, the plants still low in late April. Not yet the white-crowned expanse they would become by August. Black men and women worked those fields, bent under the sun in postures that seemed unchanged from daguerreotypes Thomas had catalogued, images from before the war. He drove past plantation homes, some restored to antebellum glory, others crumbling into picturesque ruins. He passed churches, their white steeples rising against blue skies. He passed small graveyards where Confederate monuments stood taller than the surrounding headstones, as if the dead soldiers demanded to be remembered above all others. Jackson, when he finally reached it, was a city caught between past and present. The state capitol building dominated the skyline, its dome gleaming in the afternoon sun. But surrounding it were neighborhoods that looked tired, worn, still rebuilding from wars both military and economic. The city had been burned during the conflict, and in some ways, Thomas thought, it still bore the scars. He found his apartment first, a modest second-floor unit in a building near downtown, with high ceilings and windows that didn't quite close properly. The landlady, Mrs. Pritchard, was a widow in her 60s who informed him that she didn't allow liquor, loud music, or overnight guests of questionable character. She looked at his Boston accent with suspicion, but accepted his first month's rent with practiced efficiency. The Historical Society occupied a modest brick building on a side street, unassuming and easy to miss. Thomas arrived on a Monday morning, his car packed with the few belongings he'd brought south. The air was already thick with humidity even at 8 o'clock, promising a hot day ahead. Dr. Harold Vance met him at the door. He was a man in his early 60s, graying hair combed back from a high forehead, gold-rimmed spectacles perched on a narrow nose. He wore a suit despite the heat, though the jacket was draped over a chair rather than worn. There was something bird-like about him, sharp eyes that missed nothing, quick, precise movements, a posture that suggested both alertness and years spent hunched over documents. "Mr. Whitfield, welcome," Vance said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his palm dry despite the heat. "I trust your journey was uneventful." "Long but manageable," Thomas replied. "Your telegram mentioned an unusual collection." Vance's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Come to my office, I'll explain." They walked through the building's main floor, a public room with display cases showing artifacts from Mississippi's history, Choctaw pottery, Confederate uniforms, agricultural implements, a cotton gin blade polished to a shine. The displays were professionally done but sparsely attended. An elderly couple examined a case of Civil War letters. A mother with 2 young children hurried past toward the exit. Vance's office was on the 2nd floor, a cramped room filled with books and papers. Stacks of folders covered every surface. A fan in the corner pushed hot air around without cooling anything. Through the window, Thomas could see the street below, quiet in the morning heat. "We have a situation," Vance began, settling into his chair with a sigh. 3 weeks ago, we received a donation of documents from an estate in Sunflower County. The owner, Evelyn Garrett, died in February. She was 91 years old, the last of her family line. No children, no surviving siblings or cousins. Her will specified that all historical family papers should come to us. He pulled out a folder and extracted several pages. The family was prominent before the war. Robert Garrett, Evelyn's grandfather, owned one of the largest cotton plantations in the Delta region, over 3,000 acres at its peak. The documents cover nearly 100 years, from 1820 to the beginning of this century. "How much material are we talking about?" Thomas asked. 43 crates, approximately 20,000 individual documents. Vance removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. "Your task is to catalog everything, assess the historical value, and prepare the most significant items for permanent archival. It's a 6-month project at minimum, possibly longer." Thomas felt a familiar excitement. This was exactly the kind of work he loved, diving into raw historical material, piecing together narratives from fragments. "When can I start?" "Immediately, if you'd like. I'll show you the storage room." Vance led him down a narrow corridor to a back room. He opened the door to reveal a small space completely taken over by wooden crates stacked to the ceiling. The smell hit Thomas immediately. Old paper, leather, mildew, dust, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of decades in imperfect storage. Some of the crates were professionally made, others were clearly improvised from whatever wood had been available. "The estate lawyer delivered them personally," Vance said. He seemed uncomfortable, made several comments about the family's privacy, about handling certain materials with discretion. When I asked him to be more specific, he became evasive, said we'd understand when we examined the collection. Thomas stepped into the room, running his hand along one of the crates. The wood was rough, splintering in places. "And you haven't started cataloging yet?" "I did a preliminary survey. Opened perhaps 6 or 7 crates just to assess the general content. Business records, personal correspondence, legal documents. Standard material for a wealthy family of that era, but..." Vance hesitated. "There were some things that struck me as odd. Contracts with unusual terms. Letters that seemed to be written in some kind of code or private language. Nothing definitive, but enough to make me think we needed someone with specialized experience. Hence the telegram to Boston. Hence the telegram." Vance checked his watch. "I have a board meeting this afternoon, but you're welcome to begin. Take your time with the initial assessment. Make notes on anything that seems significant. We'll discuss your findings at the end of each week." After Vance left, Thomas stood alone in the room full of crates. 43 of them, 20,000 documents, 6 months of work, possibly more. He rolled up his sleeves, pulled the first crate toward him, and pried off the lid. The documents spilled out like artifacts from a forgotten civilization. Thomas worked methodically, creating categories as he went. Personal correspondence, business records, legal documents, property records, household accounts. He set up a work table in the corner of the storage room, brought in a desk lamp, and began the slow process of examination and classification. The earliest documents dated from the 1820s, letters from Robert Garrett's father discussing the purchase of land in Mississippi, then still a frontier region. The letters painted a picture of ambition and opportunity. "The soil here is rich beyond description," one letter read. "Cotton grows with such vigor that a man with capital and labor can make his fortune in a single generation." Labor. The word appeared again and again in those early letters, always capitalized, always meaning the same thing. By 1830, Robert Garrett had purchased 53 people. By 1840, that number had grown to 118. By 1850, 207. The ledgers recorded them with the same clinical detail as livestock: names, ages, physical descriptions, skills, values. Thomas had seen such documents before in northern archives, but always at a distance, always as historical artifacts divorced from their immediate context. Here, surrounded by the accumulated debris of the family that had owned these people, the reality felt more immediate, more visceral. He found letters from 1852 discussing the purchase of a woman named Catherine and her 3 children. The seller praised Catherine's skills as a seamstress and cook. The price was $2,600 for the family. Thomas found himself staring at that number, trying to reconcile the figure with the human beings it represented. The documents from the 1850s showed the plantation at its peak. Detailed harvest records revealed cotton production increasing year by year. Account books showed expenditures on tools, buildings, livestock, and, most chillingly, rewards for returned runaways. One entry from 1857, $25 paid to J. Patterson for return of Gabriel, recaptured in Vicksburg. There were inventories that listed people alongside furniture. In the main house, 1 mahogany dining table, 12 chairs, 1 sideboard, 1 silver tea service. In service to the household: Rose, cook, age 34, Martha, housekeeper, age 41, Lucy, personal maid, age 19. Thomas worked through that first week in a state of controlled disturbance. He had studied this history, understood it intellectually, but something about handling the actual documents, seeing the handwriting of people who had treated other humans as property, made it terrifyingly concrete. On Wednesday afternoon, he found a ledger from 1859 that stopped him cold. It was titled "Breeding Record" and contained entries tracking births, noting parentage, recording infant mortality rates. The entries were matter of fact. Rose delivered a boy child on March 14th, healthy, added to nursery group. Or, Martha's infant died in the night, cause uncertain. Thomas set the ledger aside and stepped outside, needing air. The street was quiet in the afternoon heat. A few cars passed. A woman walked by with a basket of groceries, the mundane present existing alongside this documented horror from the past. He went back inside. There was more to catalogue. The documents from the Civil War years told a story of growing anxiety. Letters from 1861 were optimistic, confident in quick Southern victory. By 1862, the tone had shifted to concern about military setbacks and economic pressure. By 1863, there was real fear. A letter from Robert Garrett to his brother, dated May 1863. "The Lincoln forces grow bolder by the day. We hear reports of plantations abandoned as the Federals advance. Some of our people have disappeared, run off toward the Union lines, seeking false promises of freedom. I have increased security and discipline to prevent further losses." Another letter from January 1864. "The situation grows desperate. Half our able-bodied hands have fled. The remaining are increasingly defiant. I fear what will come if the federal troops reach this far. Not just defeat, but complete social upheaval. The natural order that has sustained us is under attack." Thomas noted the language. Natural order. As if the enslavement of human beings was ordained by nature itself. The documents from 1865 were sparse. A brief letter from April. "It is finished. Lee has surrendered. All that we built, all that we were, is gone. I do not know how we will continue. But continue they did, and the documents from the months after the war showed how. It was late Friday afternoon of his third week when Thomas made the discovery that would change everything. He had developed a rhythm by then. Each morning he arrived at 8, catalogued until noon, took a brief lunch at a diner down the street, returned to work until 6 or 7 in the evening. He had processed roughly half the collection, 21 crates, approximately 10,000 documents. The scope of the material was becoming clear. This was not just a family archive, but a comprehensive record of a plantation economy from its founding through its decline. The crate he opened that Friday was marked simply Office Main Desk, 1860-1875. It contained mainly business ledgers, thick books with leather covers where transactions were recorded in meticulous copperplate handwriting. Thomas had seen dozens of such ledgers already. They were important for economic historians, but generally tedious to examine, page after page of numbers, dates, commodities, prices. He pulled out the first ledger and opened it. Cotton sales from 1860. 17 pages of entries detailing bales sold, prices received, buyers' names, shipping information. Valuable data for someone studying agricultural economics, but not his primary focus at the moment. The second ledger covered the years 1861-1863. Similar content, sales, purchases, expenditures. The numbers showed declining revenues as the war progressed, matching what Thomas had seen in the correspondence. The third ledger was different. It was larger than the others, bound in dark brown leather that was cracked with age. The cover bore no title or date, just a small brass clasp that had long since lost its lock mechanism. Thomas opened it and found what appeared to be routine plantation records from 1865-1866, cotton production, tool purchases, building repairs. But something felt wrong. The book was too thick. The spine was wider than the number of written pages would require. Thomas set it aside and continued cataloguing, but his eyes kept returning to it. Finally, at nearly 6 o'clock, he picked up the ledger again and examined it more carefully. He opened it flat on the table, studying the binding. The leather cover extended about half an inch beyond the edge of the pages. Normal for books of this era. But when he pressed on the back cover, he felt something yield slightly, as if there was space between the leather and the wood backing. His heart began to beat faster. He had seen secret compartments in books before. In the Boston archives, he'd catalogued a family Bible with a hidden space where jewelry had been concealed during the war. This felt similar. He retrieved a thin letter opener from his desk and carefully worked it under the edge of the leather lining on the inside back cover. The glue had weakened with age. Slowly, carefully, he separated the leather from the board beneath. And there it was. A cavity had been carved into the thick wooden backing of the cover, roughly 6 inches by 9 inches and perhaps half an inch deep. Inside that cavity lay another book. Thomas lifted it out with trembling hands. It was much thinner than the ledger that had concealed it, perhaps 50 pages at most. The cover was smooth black leather, unmarked by any title or decoration. The pages were of higher quality paper than most documents he'd examined, a creamy ivory stock that had aged well. He opened it. The first page contained only a title written in elegant black ink. Book of Special Arrangements, 1865-1873. And below, in smaller letters, Confidential, Members Only. Thomas felt his mouth go dry. He turned the page. What he saw made him forget about the time, forget about his dinner, forget about everything except the document in front of him. The pages were ruled into columns, each entry recorded with the same meticulous care as the plantation ledgers. But these columns contained information Thomas had never seen in any historical document. Entry after entry, hundreds of them. The first page began, the entries continued, page after page. Thomas flipped through the book quickly, seeing the dates progress through the years. 1865, 1866, 1867, continuing all the way to 1873. Hundreds of names, hundreds of people. The codes repeated: RC7, RC9, DP12, DP15, CT3, CT5, and others. The notes varied but used consistent terminology: transferred, assigned, extended, applicable, strict supervision, program. Thomas realized immediately what he was looking at. The dates began right after April 1865, right after Lee's surrender, right after the war ended, right after abolition. These were records of people who should have been free. But the codes, the monetary values, the notes about programs and assignments, this was documentation of something else. Something that had been hidden in this book's secret compartment for nearly 90 years. Thomas checked his watch. It was past 7. The building was empty except for him. He should leave, go home, think about this carefully. But he couldn't put the book down. He photographed each page with the Society's camera working by lamplight, his hands shaking slightly as he advanced the film. When he finished photographing the last page, an entry from December 1873, it was past 9 o'clock. Thomas carefully returned the book to its hiding place, sealed the leather lining back down as well as he could, and placed the larger ledger back in its crate. He gathered the film and his notes and left the building, locking the door behind him. The street was quiet, a few cars passing under streetlights. The night air was warm and thick, carrying the scent of honeysuckle from somewhere nearby. Thomas drove to his apartment, his mind racing. He didn't understand yet what the codes meant, what programs referred to, why monetary values were attached to people who were supposed to be free. But he understood enough to know this was significant. This was evidence of something that had been deliberately concealed. In his apartment, he spread out his notes on the small dining table and began to organize what he knew. 1. The book was hidden, suggesting its contents were secret, possibly illegal. The dates began immediately after Abolition 3. The entries recorded people with codes, values, and placement information. 4. The term members only suggested an organized group. 5. The careful record-keeping implied a systematic operation. Thomas worked late into the night, categorizing the codes, noting patterns, making lists of the repeated terms. He fell asleep at the table, his head on his arms, surrounded by photographs of pages that documented something the original keepers had never intended to be revealed. Thomas woke Saturday morning with a stiff neck and a sense of urgent purpose. He spent the weekend in his apartment, analyzing the photographs. He created spreadsheets, old accounting paper he'd bought at a stationery store, tracking every entry in the hidden ledger. By Sunday evening, clear patterns had emerged. The codes, RC series, RC1 through RC15. These appeared most frequently, accounting for roughly 40% of all entries. The number following RC seemed to indicate work type or assignment location. DP series, DP10 through DP20. These appeared in about 30% of entries, often accompanied by notes about transfers or previous issues. CT series, CT1 through CT10. These appeared in about 20% of entries and were almost always associated with younger individuals. Notes often mentioned minors or apprenticeship. Other codes appeared less frequently, FS, TR, SR, each with their own numbering system. The values. Monetary amounts ranged from $180 to $800, with most entries between $350 and $550. Thomas noticed that certain codes correlated with higher values. DP codes averaged $475. RC codes averaged $420. CT codes averaged $310. The amounts were substantial for 1865. For comparison, Thomas knew that farm laborers at the time might earn $15, $20 per month. These weren't wages. They were too large, too irregular. They looked more like... Thomas didn't want to complete that thought, but the evidence was inescapable. They looked like purchase prices. The notes. Certain phrases appeared repeatedly. Transferred to name program appeared 147 times. Extended contract appeared 98 times. Family applicable appeared 73 times. Strict supervision appeared 54 times. Apprenticeship term appeared 67 times. Previous discipline issues appeared 41 times. Reassignment required pen appeared 29 times. Thomas created a timeline. The entries began in May 1865 and peaked in the summer months of 1865 and 1866. After that, the frequency declined, but continued steadily through 1873, then stopped abruptly. He made lists of the names mentioned in the transferred to notes. Harrison, mentioned 31 times. Peterson, mentioned 28 times. Douglas, mentioned 24 times. Warren, mentioned 19 times. Finch, mentioned 17 times. Others mentioned less frequently. These weren't first names. They were surnames, people, or perhaps places where individuals were being transferred. By the time Thomas returned to the Historical Society on Monday morning, he had formed a working hypothesis. But he needed more evidence. He needed to find documents that would explain the codes, identify the names, and reveal what system this ledger was documenting. He returned to the crates with new purpose. Thomas spent Monday morning methodically searching through the remaining uncatalogued crates, looking for anything that might connect to the secret ledger. He found routine business documents, personal correspondence, household accounts. Nothing unusual. Then, in a crate marked Legal Documents Various, he found them. They were contracts. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, tied together in bundles with faded ribbon. The paper was official-looking, pre-printed forms with blank spaces filled in by hand. Thomas untied the first bundle and began to read. The contracts were titled Agreement for Labor Services and dated from 1865 through the early 1870s. Each one followed the same basic format. This agreement made this date day of month 1865 between landowner name, hereafter known as the employer, and worker name, hereafter known as the employee, establishes the following terms. The employee agrees to provide faithful labor services to the employer for a period of term years, beginning on the date of this agreement. The employee shall 1. Work exclusively for the employer in such capacity as the employer designates. 2. Reside on the employer's property for the duration of this agreement. 3. Not leave the property without written permission from the employer. 4. Follow all reasonable instructions and submit to reasonable discipline. 5. Work such hours as are customary for the type of labor assigned. 6. Care for all tools and property entrusted to them. The employer agrees to provide 1. Housing appropriate to the employee's station. 2. Food rations sufficient for health. 3. Basic medical care when necessary. 4. Wages of amount per month. The following additional conditions apply. Wages shall be paid at the end of each year, not monthly. Deductions shall be made for housing $3 month, food $8 month, medical care actual cost, clothing actual cost, tools actual cost, damages to property assessed value. If the employee leaves before the term expires, all wages are forfeit, and the employee shall be liable for damages equal to the remaining value of the contract. The employer retains the right to transfer this contract to another party with similar interests. Any disputes shall be resolved by local magistrate selected by the employer. If the employee has family members also entering into agreements, said agreements shall be considered jointly binding, signed, and witnessed this day. Thomas read contract after contract, his stomach tightening with each one. On the surface they looked legitimate, employment agreements between landowners and free laborers. But the terms. He did quick calculations. If someone earned $12 per month but had deductions of $11 per month, $3 for housing, $8 for food, they would net only $12 per year. And that assumed no other deductions for clothing, medical care, tools, or damages. In practice, workers could easily end up owing money rather than earning it. The clauses about leaving were particularly insidious. Leave before the term expired and you lost everything, years of labor with no compensation, and you became liable for damages that could be assessed at any amount. The clause about family members being jointly binding meant that if you had a spouse or children also under contract, you couldn't leave without abandoning them. If one family member violated their contract, the whole family could face penalties. And then Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the upper right corner of many contracts, written in light pencil, were codes. He pulled out several contracts and compared them. A contract for Sarah Miller, dated May 12, 1865, bore the code RC7. He checked his notes from the secret ledger. Sarah M., dated May 14, 1865, code RC7. The dates didn't match exactly, but they were close, within days, and the codes were identical. Thomas spread out dozens of contracts on the work table and began cross-referencing them against his photographs of the secret ledger. Again and again he found matches. Joseph Kendrick, contract dated June 1, 1865, code DP12. Joseph K., ledger entry, June 3, 1865, code DP12. Hannah Travis, contract dated June 26, 1865, code RC7. Hannah T., a ledger entry June 28, 1865, code RC7. Daniel Robinson, contract dated June 30, 1865, code RC9. Daniel R., ledger entry July 2, 1865, code RC9. The pattern was unmistakable. The people signing these contracts were the same people listed in the secret ledger. The contracts were signed first. Then a few days later, entries appeared in the ledger with codes and monetary values. Thomas found a contract that made the connection even clearer. It was for a man named Marcus Davis, dated July 13, 1865. The contract term was 5 years. In the margins, someone had written in neat script, transferred to DP15 category per previous incidents. Harrison placement approved. Value assessment, $640. And later in the bundle of contracts, he found a second document for Marcus Davis, dated July 16, 1865. This one was different, a transfer of contract agreement. It stated that Robert Garrett was transferring Marcus Davis's labor contract to William Harrison of Harrison Plantation, Harrison County. The transfer price, $640. Thomas sat back in his chair, his hands shaking. This wasn't just exploitative labor contracts. This was a system for buying and selling human beings under the cover of legal employment agreements. The contracts were designed to trap people in perpetual debt. And then those contracts, those people, were being traded among plantation owners like property. Abolition had made slavery illegal, but these men had found a way to continue it under a different name. Thomas spent the next 3 days in a state of controlled obsession. He catalogued every contract, created cross-references to the secret ledger, and began mapping the network of names that appeared in the transfer documents. The scale was staggering. He found contracts for over 600 people, all dating from 1865 to 1873. Not all of them appeared in the secret ledger. The hidden book seemed to record only certain categories of transactions, but the contracts showed the breadth of the system, and the names of other plantation owners appeared again and again. Harrison, Peterson, Douglas, Warren, Finch, Montgomery, Stevens, Crawford. Each appeared in transfer agreements, sometimes as sellers, sometimes as buyers, always as participants in what Thomas had begun thinking of as the network. Then he found the letter that confirmed his suspicions. It was in a bundle of correspondence from 1865, addressed to Robert Garrett from someone named William Harrison. The letter was dated July 12, 1865, just weeks after the war ended. It read, "My dear Robert, I trust this finds you and your family well in these uncertain times. As discussed at our gathering last month, I write to confirm the arrangements we established. The collapse of our previous labor system presents both crisis and opportunity. We find ourselves with land and capital but no reliable workforce. The former people, now technically free, find themselves with freedom but no property, no education, no means of support. Both parties need each other, but the relationship must be properly structured to ensure stability and productivity. The framework we discussed addresses this situation. The standardized contracts establish clear terms of employment while preventing the chaos of free movement. The evaluation system ensures workers are properly matched to appropriate locations and supervisors. The transfer mechanism allows flexibility in workforce allocation while maintaining control. I enclose the contract templates we agreed upon, along with the coding system for confidential record keeping. Please note the categories: RC, residential continuous. Workers from your own previous holdings, continuing in place DP, disciplinary placement. Workers requiring firm supervision, transferred from other locations, CT, contracted training. Younger workers in apprenticeship arrangements, FS, family separation. Individual workers with family ties requiring management TR, temporary reassignment. Short-term transfers for specific projects, SR, special restriction. Workers with particular issues requiring oversight. The coding allows us to maintain private records of transactions and evaluations without drawing unwanted attention to our arrangements. Official paperwork shows only legal employment contracts. Our private ledgers track the more detailed information necessary for effective management. I have spoken with Peterson, Douglas, Warren, and Finch. All are in agreement and eager to participate. I propose we formalize our cooperation with regular meetings to coordinate our efforts and share information about troublesome workers or successful practices. Our first gathering will be held at my estate on the 15th of next month. I hope you will attend. Discretion is paramount. We meet under the auspices of the Delta Agricultural Preservation Society, a name that should draw no particular notice while accurately reflecting our purpose. The federal authorities are currently too distracted by political conflicts to pay close attention to local labor arrangements. But we must be cautious. Everything we do must appear legal and voluntary. The contracts serve that purpose. Our private records remain private. I look forward to our continued cooperation in preserving the agricultural prosperity that built this region. Yours in mutual interest, William Harrison. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his horror growing with each reading. This wasn't opportunistic exploitation by isolated landowners. This was organized conspiracy, planned and executed deliberately. He searched through more correspondence and found additional letters between members of what Harrison had called the Delta Agricultural Preservation Society. The letters discussed logistics, how to word contracts to maximize control while maintaining legal appearance, how to deal with workers who refused to sign, how to handle federal agents who asked questions, how to share information about troublesome individuals who needed to be blacklisted or transferred to more isolated locations. One letter from Robert Peterson to Robert Garrett, dated September 1865, was particularly revealing. I have found the system works best when implemented immediately, before the former people have time to organize alternatives. Sign them quickly, lock them into multi-year terms, ensure the deductions leave them with no means to leave. The key is the family connections. A man might risk his own freedom, but rarely if it means abandoning his wife and children. For those who resist, there are means. The local magistrates understand our position. The sheriff's office cooperates in retrieving contract violators. I have found that a few public examples of contract enforcement discourage others from attempting to leave. The DP categories work well. Transfer troublemakers to isolated locations under stricter supervision. My experience suggests that 6 months of DP-15 conditions make most workers considerably more compliant when returned to standard assignments. Thomas felt nauseated. These weren't businessmen making difficult decisions in hard times. These were men systematically engineering a system to enslave people by other means. He found more evidence, a membership list for the Delta Agricultural Preservation Society, listing 23 plantation owners from 5 counties in Mississippi. Minutes from their meetings discussing labor management strategies. Financial records showing membership dues and contributions to a shared fund used for problem resolution, which seemed to mean bribing local officials and hiring men to retrieve runaway contract workers. The system they had created was comprehensive. 1. Recruitment phase. Approach newly freed people immediately. Offer employment contracts with terms that sounded reasonable. 2. Entrapment phase. Ensure contract terms made it impossible to leave. debt accumulation, family binding, legal penalties. Control, phase, strict supervision, limited movement, harsh discipline for violations. 4. Transfer mechanism, trade workers among network members based on needs and behavioral issues. 5. Legal protection, maintain facade of voluntary employment while using contracts, local officials, and intimidation to enforce compliance. And the secret ledger documented it all. Not the official story of voluntary employment contracts, but the reality. People being assigned codes, assessed monetary values, transferred like property among network members. Thomas found entries in the ledger that showed the system's evolution. Early entries from 1865-1866 were straightforward. Person signed contract, received code, entered into system. But later entries showed complications. Behind each entry was a person who had believed freedom was coming, only to find themselves trapped in a new form of bondage. As Thomas continued to catalogue the documents, he began to find fragments of the human stories behind the ledger entries. Letters written by workers to family members, confiscated and filed with property records. Testimony from legal proceedings. Notes from plantation overseers about specific individuals. One file contained a letter dated June 1866 from a woman named Sarah Miller to her sister in Memphis. The letter had apparently been confiscated before it could be sent. Dear Lottie, I write hoping this reaches you, though I have little faith it will. They watch us close and we cannot leave without papers. When freedom came, I thought everything would change, but it is not so different as I hoped. Mr. Garrett came to us in May last year, just after the soldiers left. He said we could stay and work for wages. We had nowhere else to go, no money, nowhere to get food. So we signed papers. We could not read them, but he said it was just for work, that we would be paid. The wages never come. He says we owe for the cabin, for food, for clothes, for everything. After the owing is counted, there is nothing left. When Joseph tried to leave last month to find other work, they brought him back, made him sign new papers. Now he cannot leave for 5 more years. They call us free, but how are we free when we cannot leave? How are we free when we are watched and counted and punished for the same things as before? The only difference is the words they use. I think of you in Memphis with your new husband and your new life. I am glad you got away before this started. Tell your children about me so they will remember. I do not know when I will see you again. Your sister Sarah. The letter was dated June 1866. By then, according to additional documents Thomas found, Sarah Miller had been transferred to Harrison's plantation in a deal worth $450. She never saw her sister again. She died in 1871, still under contract, still technically free but practically enslaved. Another file contained testimony from a legal proceeding in 1869. A man named Marcus Davis had attempted to sue for freedom from his contract, claiming it violated his rights. The testimony was transcribed. Mr. Davis states, I signed the paper in July 1865 because they said it was for work. I did not know it said 5 years. I cannot read. They said I would be paid money. I have never been paid. They say I owe for everything. They moved me to another place without asking. They say if I leave they will put me in jail. This is not freedom. This is the same as before with different words. Mr. Harrison's attorney states, Mr. Davis freely entered into a legal contract for employment. The terms are clearly stated in the document. If Mr. Davis cannot read, that is his deficiency, not our responsibility. He has been provided housing, food, and medical care as stipulated. His labor compensates for these provisions. The contract is legally binding and must be honored. Any attempt to leave constitutes breach of contract and theft of services rendered. Magistrate ruling. The contract appears legally sound. Mr. Davis entered into it voluntarily. The court finds no basis to void the agreement. Mr. Davis is ordered to fulfill his contractual obligations. Should he attempt to leave before the term expires, he shall be subject to penalties as specified in the contract terms. The The previous discipline issues apparently meant he had tried to escape from Garrett's plantation before being transferred to Harrison's. After the 1869 court ruling, there were no more records of Marcus Davis. He simply disappeared from the documentation. File after file revealed similar stories. People who believed they were signing employment agreements only to find themselves trapped. People who tried to leave and were forcibly returned. People who complained to authorities and were transferred to more isolated locations. Families separated because one member violated contract terms. Thomas found a particularly heartbreaking series of documents involving a woman named Hannah Travis and her 3 children. Hannah had signed a contract with Garrett in June 1865. Her 3 children, ages 7, 9, and 12, were simultaneously signed into apprenticeship agreements that bound them to work until age 21. Hannah's contract was for 5 years. When it expired in 1870, she asked to leave with her children. But the children's apprenticeships had years remaining. The plantation management informed her she could leave if she chose, but her children would stay to fulfill their agreements. Hannah stayed. Thomas found a note in a plantation overseer's daily log from July 1870. Hannah Travis informed she is free to go. She refuses to leave without children. Re-signed to new 5-year contract, effective control maintained through family binding. Hannah Travis appeared in the secret ledger 3 times. The system had been designed to exploit exactly this kind of situation. Use family connections as leverage. Trap people not just through debt, but through love. Thomas began creating a separate file of these personal stories. He felt he owed it to these people, whose names had been reduced to codes, whose lives had been reduced to monetary values, whose suffering had been hidden in a secret ledger, to document their humanity, their resistance, their stories. But the work was taking an emotional toll. Thomas found himself lying awake at night, thinking about Sarah writing letters that were never sent. Marcus standing in a courtroom where justice was denied. Hannah choosing imprisonment over abandoning her children. These weren't abstract historical events. These were atrocities. And they had been carefully planned, systematically executed, meticulously documented by men who saw nothing wrong with what they were doing. As Thomas continued through the documents, he noticed that the network's methods evolved over time. The entries in the secret ledger showed increasing sophistication in the later years. In 1865-1866, the codes were relatively simple. RC for people from the plantation, DP for transfers, CT for minors. But by 1868, the ledger showed additional notation systems. Someone, probably Robert Garrett, had added columns tracking, number of contract renewals, total years under obligation, family members in system, disciplinary incidents, productivity assessments, risk level, rated 1 to 5. It was like a database before databases existed, a management system for human beings. Thomas found training documents, actual written guidelines for how to manage workers under the contract system. One document, titled Best Practices for Labor Retention, was particularly chilling. Experience has shown the following methods most effective. 1. Contract duration. Initial contracts of 3 to 5 years are optimal. Shorter terms allow workers too much flexibility. Longer terms may face legal scrutiny. Renewal contracts should extend terms based on accumulated debt. 2. Debt management. Ensure deductions exceed wages but by amounts small enough to appear reasonable. Food charges of $6 to $10 per month, housing charges of $2 to $4 per month create steady debt accumulation without appearing excessive in any single category. 3. Family binding. Whenever possible, sign entire families. Separate child apprenticeships create powerful leverage. A worker who might risk personal consequences will rarely risk their family's welfare. 4. Mobility restriction. Require written permission for any departure from property. Track all movement. Workers found off property without permission should face contract extensions as penalty. 5. Information control. Limit workers' contact with outside parties. Monitor correspondence. Discourage visits from family members not under contract. Prevent organization or collective action. 6. Disciplinary measures. Swift response to rule violations maintains control. Recommended penalties, contract extensions, wage forfeitures, transfer to harsher conditions, family separation as final resort. 7. Legal appearance. Maintain proper documentation. All actions must have contractual basis. Use local legal authorities to enforce contract terms. Present system as legitimate employment relationship. 8. Network cooperation. Share information about troublesome workers. Support each other in contract enforcement. Present unified position to federal authorities. Regular coordination prevents workers from escaping system by moving between properties. Thomas felt sick reading it. This was a manual for oppression, written with the same calm professionalism as a farming almanac or bookkeeping guide. But what made it even more disturbing was that it worked. The ledger showed the system functioning with brutal efficiency. Of the 600 people whose contracts Thomas had found, he could document only 17 who successfully escaped the system before their contracts expired. Some died while under contract. The ledger noted these with simple entries. Deceased, contract terminated. Some aged out or completed their terms. But most remained trapped, cycling through contract renewals, accumulating debt, watched and controlled. The network's membership also evolved. Thomas found documents showing that by 1870, the original 23 members had grown to 37. Plantation owners from neighboring counties heard about the system and requested to join. The Delta Agricultural Preservation Society established formal membership procedures, including membership fee of $500, agreement to use standardized contracts, participation in information sharing, support for contract enforcement, confidential record keeping using approved coding systems, attendance at quarterly coordination meetings. The society even created committees. Legal affairs, managing relationships with local courts and law enforcement, workforce allocation, coordinating transfers between members, discipline and control, handling enforcement issues, external relations, managing interactions with federal authorities. It was, Thomas realized, a sophisticated criminal enterprise masquerading as an agricultural business association. But by 1872, cracks were appearing. Thomas found correspondence showing increasing anxiety among network members. A letter from Harrison to Garrett, March 1872. The federal presence is increasing. They are asking more questions about labor conditions. We must be more cautious with documentation. I suggest we limit written records of our more sensitive arrangements. Another letter from Peterson to Garrett, August 1872. Several workers have escaped to the north and are apparently telling their stories to abolitionist organizations. There is talk of new federal investigations. We may need to modify our practices or risk exposure. Minutes from a Delta Agricultural Preservation Society meeting, November 1872. Discussion of legal vulnerabilities. Growing federal scrutiny. Recommendation to gradually transition from explicit contract binding to more subtle sharecropping arrangements that achieve similar control with less legal risk. The secret ledger's final entries were from December 1873. After that, nothing. The system hadn't ended because the plantation owners suddenly developed consciences. It had ended because the legal and political environment had shifted enough to make the explicit contract system too risky. But Thomas found evidence that many of the same people simply transitioned to sharecropping, a system that trapped workers through debt and limited opportunities rather than explicit contracts. Different mechanism, similar result. The network had operated for 8 years. Based on the contracts and ledger entries, Thomas estimated that approximately 3,000 people had been trapped in the system during that time. 3,000 people who thought freedom had come, only to find themselves bound by paper chains instead of iron ones. Thomas had been working alone for nearly 3 weeks since discovering the secret ledger. He had kept it hidden, continuing to photograph and document while wrestling with what to do with the information. Part of him wanted to immediately expose everything, publish the findings, contact newspapers, shout from the rooftops about what he had discovered. But another part urged caution. He needed to understand the full scope, verify every detail, build an undeniable case. And if he was being honest with himself, he was also afraid. The people who had operated this system were long dead, but their descendants still lived in Mississippi, still had power and influence. What would happen when he revealed that some of the state's most prominent families had conspired to enslave people after abolition? Finally, on a Thursday morning in late May, Thomas made his decision. He gathered the secret ledger, the most damning contracts, the correspondence about the network, and the personal stories he had documented. He organized everything into a comprehensive file and went to Dr. Vance's office. Vance was at his desk, working through a stack of correspondence. He looked up when Thomas knocked. "Mr. Whitfield, come in. How is the cataloging proceeding?" "Dr. Vance, I need to show you something significant." Thomas closed the office door and laid out the documents on Vance's desk. He explained the discovery of the hidden ledger, the contracts with their restrictive terms, the correspondence revealing the Delta Agricultural Preservation Society, the evidence of an organized system to trap freed people into continued bondage. He spoke for nearly 30 minutes, walking Vance through the evidence piece by piece. The older man listened in silence, examining the documents with trembling hands. When Thomas finished, Vance removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked older, suddenly, tired. "I was afraid of this," Vance said quietly. Thomas felt his stomach drop. "You knew?" "Not specifically, not the details, but when the estate donation came, there were concerns." Vance set his glasses on the desk. Evelyn Garrett's lawyer sent a private letter along with the transfer papers. He suggested that some materials might be historically significant, but sensitive. He didn't specify what. "I assumed documents related to slavery before the war. That's disturbing enough, but at least historically acknowledged. This," he gestured at the ledger, "this is worse than I imagined." "What do we do?" Thomas asked. Vance was silent for a long moment, staring at the secret ledger. "That's the question, isn't it? This evidence exposes crimes even if the perpetrators are long dead. It implicates some of the most prominent families in the state, families whose descendants still have considerable power and influence. Are you suggesting we hide it?" Thomas felt anger rising in his chest. "No, absolutely not. But I'm asking you to consider the consequences of revealing it. There will be resistance, powerful resistance. People will say we're stirring up old wounds, that it serves no purpose to expose events from so long ago, that we're attacking respected families with information taken from their private papers. These aren't private papers anymore. They were donated to a historical society. And this isn't about attacking families. It's about historical truth. These people," Thomas pointed to the names in the ledger, "they deserve to have their stories told. What happened to them matters." Vance nodded slowly. "I agree completely, but we need to be smart about this. If we simply announce the discovery, it will be dismissed as sensationalism, buried in controversy. We need to document everything meticulously, prepare for intense scrutiny, and go through proper channels." "What channels?" "Academic journals first. We need historians from outside Mississippi, people removed from local politics, to examine and validate the findings. We need their authority to support the authenticity and significance of these documents. Then, we can approach broader publication, possibly even a book documenting the complete collection." Thomas wanted to argue for immediate public disclosure, but he recognized the wisdom in Vance's approach. A careful, methodical revelation backed by scholarly authority would be harder to dismiss than a dramatic announcement. "How long will this take?" Thomas asked. "Months, certainly. Perhaps a year or more, but this discovery isn't going anywhere. We can afford to do this properly." Vance picked up the secret ledger carefully, as if it might burn his hands. "This is perhaps the most significant historical document I've encountered in 30 years of archival work. It changes our understanding of Reconstruction, of how abolition was resisted and subverted. We owe it to history and to the people documented in these pages to handle this correctly. Thomas agreed, though part of him chafed at the delay. He wanted justice for Sarah Miller and Marcus Davis and Hannah Travis, even if that justice was only the justice of having their stories told. "I'll need to bring this to the board of directors," Vance said. "The discovery is too significant to keep from them. But I'll recommend we begin preparing a scholarly presentation of the findings while maintaining confidentiality until we're ready for publication." "And if the board says no?" Vance met his eyes. "Then I'll resign, and we'll find another institution to work with. This is too important to bury." The board meeting took place the following Tuesday. Thomas wasn't invited to attend, but Dr. Vance promised to present the findings and advocate for proper scholarly publication. Thomas spent the day anxiously cataloging documents, unable to concentrate. At 5 o'clock, Vance appeared in the doorway of the storage room. His face was grim. "We need to talk." In Vance's office, the older man poured them both coffee from a thermos, though his hand shook slightly as he did so. "The board meeting did not go well," Vance began. "I presented the findings to all 7 board members. 3 of them were genuinely interested and supportive of publication. But the other 4, he paused. Their reaction was hostile. One member, Samuel Whitmore, became quite agitated. Apparently his grandmother was a Garrett, a cousin to the family whose papers you've been cataloging. He views any negative revelation as an attack on his family's honor. "But it's not about honor," Thomas protested. "It's about truth. For some people, there's no distinction." Whitmore argued that publishing this material would serve no purpose except to embarrass respected families and inflame racial tensions. He claimed we have no right to air what he called private family matters, and suggested that doing so would violate the terms of the estate donation. That's nonsense. The papers were donated to a historical society, specifically for historical preservation and scholarship. I made that argument. It didn't matter. Whitmore has significant influence on the board. By the end of the meeting, 2 of the originally supportive members had shifted to his position. The board voted 5-2 against proceeding with publication at this time. Thomas felt fury rising. They can't just bury this. Technically they can. They control the institution's publications, but... Vance leaned forward. "They can't control us. I told the board that I disagree with their decision, and that as director, I retain discretion over scholarly access to materials in our collection. I will continue preparing documentation of these findings and will share them with qualified researchers. If the board objects to that interpretation of my authority, I will resign." What did they say? Whitmore threatened exactly that, demanded I resign. But 2 other board members, the ones who voted with me, defended my position. We ended in a stalemate. I remain as director for now, but with clear opposition from a majority of the board. "So what do we do?" Vance smiled slightly. "We continue the work. We document everything. And we begin reaching out to historians and institutions outside Mississippi. The board controls this institution, but they don't control the entire academic world." Over the following week, Vance began making quiet contacts. He wrote to colleagues at universities in the North, historians who specialized in reconstruction. He described the discovery in general terms, gauging interest in examining the materials. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Every historian Vance contacted expressed intense interest in reviewing the documents. Several began making plans to visit Jackson to examine the collection firsthand. But the resistance was growing too. Thomas began noticing subtle changes in his work environment. The custodian, who had always greeted him cheerfully, now avoided eye contact. The secretary, who had been helpful with supplies, became curt and unhelpful. He overheard conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached. Then one morning, Thomas arrived to find the lock on the storage room had been changed. His key no longer worked. He found Dr. Vance, who looked furious. "Whitmore's doing." He convinced the facilities manager to change the locks on several rooms, including document storage, claiming it was a security upgrade. "I've ordered a new key for you. but it will take a few days. He's trying to block access to the documents. Yes, but he's not succeeding. I have a master key, and I'm authorizing you to work in my office with materials brought from storage. It's less convenient, but it will have to do. That afternoon, Thomas received a phone call at the Society. A man who identified himself only as a concerned citizen told him that people are watching, and that certain historical matters are better left in the past. The call ended before Thomas could respond. He told Vance about it. The older man's expression darkened. I've received similar calls. Whoever is behind this wants to intimidate us. Is it working? On me? No. But I'm 63 years old with a modest pension already secure. You're 28 with a career ahead of you. I will understand if you want to step back from this. Thomas thought about Sarah Miller's letter, never sent. About Marcus Davis standing in a courtroom where justice was denied. About Hannah Travis choosing captivity over abandoning her children. I'm not stopping, he said. The following week brought escalating pressure. 2 board members formally called for Dr. Vance's dismissal. A local newspaper ran an article, carefully worded but clearly hostile, about controversial materials at the Historical Society and questions about whether sensational claims about respected historical families served legitimate scholarly purposes. Thomas's landlady, Mrs. Pritchard, mentioned that she had received inquiries about her tenant from concerned parties. She didn't elaborate, but her manner became cooler. Then the legal threats began. Thomas received a letter from an attorney representing several families, descendants of Delta Agricultural Preservation Society members. The letter claimed that any publication of materials from the Garrett estate would constitute defamation, invasion of privacy, and misuse of donated materials. It demanded that Thomas cease all work related to the documents and threatened legal action if he proceeded with publication. Similar letters went to Dr. Vance and to the Historical Society's board. Vance's response was to forward copies to the American Historical Association and the American Civil Liberties Union, both of which immediately expressed support for the scholars' right to examine and publish historical materials. They're desperate, Vance said. These legal threats have no merit. The documents are legitimately in our possession. The research is scholarly, and the First Amendment protects publication. But they're hoping to intimidate us or at least slow us down. Despite the pressure, or perhaps because of it, scholars began arriving to examine the documents. Professor Eleanor Wright from Yale came first, spending a week in Jackson reviewing the secret ledger and related materials. Her assessment was unequivocal. The documents were authentic, historically significant, and documented a systematic effort to subvert abolition. Professor James Morrison from the University of Chicago arrived next. His specialty was Reconstruction-era labor systems. He spent 3 weeks examining every contract, comparing them to similar documents from other states, building a comprehensive analysis of how the Mississippi network fit into broader patterns of exploitation. Both scholars began preparing articles for academic journals. Both faced pressure. Morrison received a call from a donor to his university, questioning why he was attacking the South. But both continued their work. By late July, Thomas and Vance had assembled a comprehensive documentation package, high-quality photographs of every page of the secret ledger, transcriptions of key contracts and correspondence, analysis of the network's structure and operations, biographical information on network members, and the personal stories of people caught in the system. Professor Wright helped them prepare a detailed article for the Journal of American History, one of the most prestigious historical publications. The article was titled, "The Delta Agricultural Preservation Society, a Case Study in Post-Abolition Labor Control." The journal's editor read the submission and immediately recognized its significance. He fast-tracked it through the peer review process. By September, the article was accepted for publication in the December 1952 issue. But before the article could appear, the story broke in an unexpected way. Her name was Margaret Foster, and she was an investigative journalist for the Chicago Daily Tribune. She had spent the past year researching a broader story about post-Civil War labor practices across the South, interviewing descendants of formerly enslaved people, examining court records, piecing together patterns of exploitation. She heard rumors about documents in Mississippi, whispers in academic circles about a significant discovery that was meeting local resistance. She made phone calls, contacted scholars, and eventually reached Professor Morrison, who mentioned his work with materials at the Mississippi Historical Society. Margaret arrived in Jackson in early August, armed with press credentials and a reputation for thorough, relentless reporting. She was 42 years old, with iron gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Dr. Vance was initially hesitant to speak with her. "We're preparing scholarly publication. I'm not sure publicity right now is wise." But Thomas argued for cooperation. "The academic process is important, but it's also slow. These families are using their influence to suppress the story. A journalist with a major newspaper could make that suppression impossible." After discussion, they decided to give Margaret limited access, allowing her to examine the materials and conduct interviews, but asking her to hold publication until after the academic article appeared. Margaret agreed, and then spent 2 weeks in Jackson conducting the most thorough investigation Thomas had ever witnessed. She didn't just examine the documents, she cross-referenced them with census records, court proceedings, property records. She tracked down descendants of people named in the contracts. She located surviving court records from cases where workers had tried to challenge their contracts. She interviewed Thomas and Vance extensively. She contacted other scholars who had examined the materials. She even attempted to interview descendants of the plantation owners, though most refused to speak with her. One elderly woman, Catherine Morrison, did agree to an interview. She was the great-granddaughter of one of the network members. She told Margaret, "I know what my great-grandfather did. I found some old papers in our attic years ago, contracts with terrible terms. I tried to talk to my family about it, but they didn't want to hear it. They'd rather pretend it never happened. But it did happen, and I think people deserve to know the truth." Margaret's article was devastating in its detail. She didn't sensationalize, she simply presented the facts, letting the documents speak for themselves. She quoted extensively from the secret ledger, the contracts, the correspondence planning the network. She told the personal stories of Sarah Miller, Marcus Davis, Hannah Travis, and others. The article was titled, "Hidden Records Expose Post-Slavery Bondage System in Mississippi." It appeared on the front page of the Chicago Daily Tribune on September 14, 1952. The response was immediate and explosive. Northern newspapers picked up the story within days. The New York Times sent their own reporter to Jackson to verify the claims. Time magazine ran a feature about the discovery. Radio programs discussed it. Suddenly, the secret ledger that had been hidden for nearly a century was national news. In Mississippi, the reaction was mixed and intense. Some people were horrified by the revelations, expressing shame that such a system had operated in their state. Others were furious at what they saw as an attack on the South, claiming the documents were being misinterpreted or blown out of proportion. The families whose ancestors were named in the documents scrambled to respond. Some issued statements expressing regret for past actions. Others hired publicists to manage the crisis. A few maintained defiant silence. Several descendants filed lawsuits attempting to suppress publication of the documents, claiming invasion of privacy and defamation. None of the lawsuits succeeded. The documents were matter of public historical record, the research was legitimate scholarship, and truth was an absolute defense against defamation. But the legal battles continued through the fall, creating ongoing stress and uncertainty. The attention brought Thomas both validation and trouble. He was invited to speak at universities about the discovery. The American Historical Association honored his archival work. Graduate students began contacting him about research opportunities, but he also became a target. He received angry letters, some barely coherent in their rage. Someone painted slurs on his apartment building wall. His car's tires were slashed, twice. Once, leaving the Historical Society late at night, he found 3 men waiting in the parking lot. They didn't attack him, just stood there watching as he got in his car and drove away. But the message was clear. He was being watched, and he was unwelcome. Mrs. Pritchard, his landlady, asked him to leave. "I can't have this kind of trouble," she said. "People are talking. I have other tenants to think about." Thomas found another apartment, this one across town in a less comfortable neighborhood. He took to varying his route to work, checking over his shoulder, sleeping poorly. Dr. Vance fared no better. The board of directors, under pressure from donors and community members, voted 6-1 to terminate his employment. The official reason was differences in institutional direction and priorities. The real reason was the ledger. Vance took the dismissal with weary resignation. "I'm 63 years old. I was planning to retire in a few years anyway. But I'm angry that they think they can suppress historical truth to protect reputations." He filed a wrongful termination suit, which would drag through courts for the next year. Eventually, he would receive a settlement that paid his remaining salary, though without the pension increase he would have earned by retiring normally. Thomas faced his own employment crisis. The new director of the Historical Society, appointed by the board, made it clear that Thomas's position was no longer secure. "Your contract is month to month," he was informed. "Given the controversy surrounding your work, we think it's best if we part ways." Thomas was being fired for uncovering historical truth, but opportunities emerged from unexpected quarters. Professor Wright at Yale offered him a research position. The University of Chicago expressed interest in hosting him as a visiting scholar. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund wanted his help documenting similar systems in other southern states. Thomas chose the Yale position. It would mean leaving Mississippi, leaving the documents he'd spent months cataloging, leaving the work unfinished. But staying no longer seemed safe or productive. Before he left, he spent a final day at the Historical Society, photographing the remaining materials he hadn't yet documented. The new director watched him suspiciously, as if Thomas might steal something. Dr. Vance came to say goodbye. They stood in the parking lot, the Mississippi heat pressing down like a heavy blanket. "You did important work here," Vance said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You gave voice to people who were silenced. You exposed a system that operated in darkness. That matters more than comfort or convenience." "I keep thinking about them," Thomas said. "Sarah Miller, Marcus Davis, all of them. All. They lived through it, they suffered through it, and then they died without anyone knowing or caring what had been done to them. At least now people know. At least now their stories are told. That's the work of history," Vance replied. "Giving voice to the voiceless even decades after they're gone. You did that. Be proud." They shook hands. Thomas drove away from the Mississippi Historical Society for the last time, watching it disappear in his rearview mirror. At Yale, Thomas continued his research. The discovery of the Mississippi Ledger had sparked interest in examining similar systems throughout the South. Scholars began digging into archives in Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, and they found evidence of similar practices. In Georgia, a researcher discovered a cache of contracts nearly identical to those Thomas had found in Mississippi, with the same restrictive terms, the same debt-trapping mechanisms, the same family-binding clauses. In Louisiana, correspondence between plantation owners revealed discussions of labor retention strategies and coordination to prevent workers from escaping by moving between parishes. In South Carolina, court records showed dozens of cases where freed people had been forced to return to plantations to fulfill contracts they often couldn't read and didn't understand. The pattern was clear. The Mississippi network wasn't unique. Similar systems had operated across the South. Organized efforts by former slave owners to maintain control and extract labor even after abolition made slavery illegal. Academic conferences were organized to study these findings. Books were published analyzing the legal mechanisms used to circumvent freedom. The period immediately following the Civil War came under renewed scrutiny, and a more complex, darker picture emerged than the one typically taught. Thomas became a leading expert on what scholars began calling neo-bondage. systems that maintained many characteristics of enslavement under technically legal but profoundly unjust structures. He published articles in journals, gave lectures at universities, collaborated with other researchers examining post-war labor exploitation. The work brought him professional recognition, but also personal isolation. He struggled to maintain relationships, always preoccupied with the research, always thinking about the people whose stories he was uncovering. In 1956, he published a book titled Freedom Betrayed: Contract Labor and Economic Bondage in the Post-War South. It won academic awards and became required reading in many universities. But it was also banned in several southern school districts, condemned as propaganda by some, and celebrated as crucial historical revelation by others. The book dedicated its final chapter to the personal stories Thomas had uncovered. Sarah Miller writing letters that were never sent, Marcus Davis seeking justice in a courthouse that denied it, Hannah Travis choosing imprisonment over abandoning her children. He felt he owed them that. Recognition not just as data points but as human beings who had suffered and resisted. Reviews of the book were divided along predictable lines. Northern academics praised it as groundbreaking scholarship. Southern newspapers called it a hatchet job designed to smear the region. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either characterization allowed. Among the hundreds of letters Thomas received after his book was published, one stood out. It arrived in early 1957, written in careful script on plain stationery. Dear Professor Whitfield, my name is Dorothy Carter. I am 73 years old, and I live in Chicago, though I was born in Mississippi in 1884. I am writing because I saw your book in the library, and when I read it, I cried for 3 hours. My grandmother's name was Elizabeth Richardson. She died when I was 15, so I knew her well, heard her stories directly. She told me about the plantation where she worked after freedom came. She told me about signing papers she couldn't read, about being told she owed money for her housing and food, about trying to leave once and being brought back. When I was a child listening to her stories, I didn't understand. I thought maybe she was confused, or maybe she was exaggerating because the memories were painful. How could she be enslaved after slavery ended? It didn't make sense to me. But then I read your book. I read about the contracts, the codes, the network, and I understood. It wasn't confusion or exaggeration. It was real. It was a system. My grandmother was trapped in exactly the kind of arrangement you describe. She finally escaped in 1871, walked 50 miles to Memphis with nothing but the clothes on her back and my infant mother wrapped in a shawl. She never went back to Mississippi, never felt safe there again. She worked as a laundress in Memphis, saved enough money to send my mother to school, gave us a life. But she never felt truly free, not completely. She had nightmares until the day she died, dreams about being caught, about being forced back. I didn't understand that either when I was young. How could you not feel free if you were free? Now I understand. Because freedom on paper isn't the same as freedom in fact. Because trauma stays with you. Because when you've been betrayed once, you never fully trust again. I'm writing to thank you. Thank you for proving it was real. Thank you for documenting what happened. Thank you for giving voice to what my grandmother experienced. When people ask me about her life, I can now show them your book and say, this is what she lived through. This is why she left Mississippi and never returned. This is why she had nightmares. This is why freedom for her was always complicated. Thank you for honoring their stories. Thank you for your courage in telling the truth, even when people didn't want to hear it. With deep gratitude, Dorothy Carter. Thomas read the letter sitting at his desk in his office at Yale. When he finished, he set it down carefully and found that his hands were shaking. This was why the work mattered. Not the academic recognition or the professional advancement, but this. Giving Dorothy Carter the answer to questions she'd carried since childhood, proving that her grandmother's suffering was real, was documented, was part of a larger pattern. He wrote back immediately, Dear Mrs. Carter, thank you for your letter. It means more to me than I can adequately express. Your grandmother's story, Her courage in escaping, her strength in building a new life, her resilience in surviving trauma, deserves to be remembered. I'm honored that my work helped you understand her experience more fully. If you're willing, I would like to speak with you further about your grandmother's life. Not for publication without your permission, but for my own research. Every story matters. Every person who lived through this system deserves to be remembered as an individual, not just as data in a ledger. With respect and admiration, Thomas Whitfield. Dorothy Carter did agree to speak with him. They corresponded for the next several years, and she shared family stories, documents, photographs. Thomas included Elizabeth Richardson's story in later publications with Dorothy's permission. And he kept Dorothy's letter on his desk, in a frame. On difficult days, when he questioned whether the work was worth the cost, whether exposing painful history served any purpose, he read it again. Thomas never returned to Mississippi. The state that had been the site of his most significant discovery remained forever associated with the threats, the pressure, the forced departure. He built his career at Yale, eventually earning a full professorship, becoming a respected authority on Reconstruction and post-war labor systems. He married in 1960. Her name was Ellen, and she was a high school history teacher who shared his passion for education and social justice. She understood the importance of his work, even when it consumed him, which it often did. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. Thomas tried to give them a normal childhood, though his work inevitably shaped their lives. They grew up in a house filled with books and documents, overhearing conversations about historical atrocities and ongoing injustices. His son once asked, when he was about 12 years old, "Dad, why do you study such sad things all the time?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. Because these things happened. And if we don't study them, if we don't understand how injustice works, we can't recognize it when it happens again. The people I research, they suffered, and then they died, and for a long time no one remembered what happened to them. I think they deserve to be remembered. I think their stories matter. His son seemed to accept this answer. Years later, he would become a civil rights lawyer, carrying forward in his own way the commitment to justice that had driven his father's work. Dr. Harold Vance remained a friend and colleague until his death in 1967. They corresponded regularly, and Vance contributed to several of Thomas's publications. In his final letter, written just weeks before he passed away from heart failure, Vance reflected on the ledger's discovery. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if that book had remained hidden in its secret compartment. If it had crumbled to dust without ever being found. Would it have mattered? Would the truth have been lost forever?" But then I remember the letters we received from people like Dorothy Carter, the students who learned that history is more complex than simple narratives allow, the scholars who built on our work to uncover similar systems, the contribution to broader understanding of how oppression operates and adapts. You did important work, Thomas. Work that cost you considerably, but it mattered. It still matters. And it will continue to matter long after we're both gone. Thank you for having the courage to see it through. Thomas kept that letter until his own death in 1994. It reminded him, when doubt crept in, why the struggle had been necessary. The original secret ledger, the thin black book that Thomas had found hidden in a false compartment on that Friday afternoon in May 1952, eventually found a permanent home in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The process of transferring it there was complicated. The Mississippi Historical Society initially resisted, claiming the ledger was part of their collection and should remain in Mississippi. But after legal challenges and pressure from national historical organizations, the Society agreed to transfer the ledger to federal custody, where it could be preserved and made accessible to researchers nationwide. Today, it sits in a climate-controlled vault, available to scholars by appointment. The pages are protected but accessible, digitized so that researchers can examine high-resolution scans without handling the fragile original. It has become, in its way, famous, a primary source that changed historical understanding. It appears in documentaries about Reconstruction, It's featured in exhibitions about the struggle for freedom. Students write papers about it. Scholars still study it, finding new insights decades after its discovery. But beyond academic circles, the ledger's discovery had broader impacts. It contributed to growing awareness about how systems of oppression adapt rather than disappear, how legal frameworks can be manipulated to maintain injustice, how freedom requires not just abolition of explicit bondage, but also dismantling of structures that trap people through debt, limited opportunity, and unequal power. The families whose ancestors were documented in the ledger as owners faced different fates. Some acknowledged what had happened, expressing regret and contributing to historical education efforts. The Morrison family established a scholarship fund for descendants of people who had been trapped in contract labor systems. The Harrison family donated their plantation records to a university archive, asking scholars to study them fully and honestly. Others remained defensive. Some families tried for decades to have their names removed from historical accounts, though without success. A few maintained that their ancestors had done nothing wrong, that the contracts were legitimate business arrangements unfairly characterized as exploitation. The descendants of those whose names appeared in the ledger as the exploited had varied reactions. Many had no idea their ancestors were documented in the ledger until the story broke. For some, it provided context for family stories passed down through generations, stories about grandparents who worked on a plantation after freedom but couldn't leave, or great-grandparents who had some kind of trouble with contracts. For others, it was painful confirmation of traumas suspected but never proven. Several descendants worked with historians to trace their family members' experiences, piecing together lives from fragments of documentation. One descendant, a man named James Miller, who traced his ancestry back to Sarah Miller, spoke at a conference in 1985 about the ledger's meaning to him. For most of my life, I knew almost nothing about my great-great-grandmother except her name and that she died young in Mississippi. My great-grandmother had very few stories about her mother, and the stories she did have were sad, vague. Just that life was very hard, that she couldn't leave the plantation, that she died before she was 40. When I learned about the ledger, when I saw her name there, Sarah M., May 14, 1865, RC7, it was like a light turning on in a dark room. Suddenly I understood. She wasn't just unlucky. She wasn't just stuck in bad circumstances. She was trapped in a system designed to trap her. That knowledge is painful, but it's also validating. It proves that her suffering was real, was documented, was part of something larger than individual misfortune, and it makes me grateful to the people who brought this history to light, even though it was difficult and controversial to do so. In the decades since the ledger's discovery, historians have used it as a lens through which to examine other systems of exploitation. The patterns documented in that thin black book, debt trapping, contract manipulation, family binding, mobility restriction, legal facade over practical enslavement, appeared in other contexts. Researchers found similar mechanisms in convict leasing systems, where people were arrested on minor charges and leased to plantations as forced labor. They found parallels in sharecropping arrangements that trapped families in perpetual debt. They saw echoes in migrant labor systems with manipulated contracts and withheld wages. The ledger became a tool for understanding how power operates, how those with resources and influence can subvert laws meant to protect the vulnerable, how systems can be designed to appear legal while functioning oppressively. Modern researchers have even drawn connections to contemporary issues. Immigration systems where workers' legal status depends on employer sponsorship, creating vulnerability to exploitation. Prison labor, where incarcerated people work for minimal or no wages. Debt that traps people in predatory lending arrangements or prevents escape from abusive situations. The specific system documented in the ledger ended in the 1870s, but the patterns it revealed, the methods, the rationalizations, the systematic nature of exploitation, continued in various forms. Thomas, in his later writings, reflected on this. The Delta Agricultural Preservation Society operated for less than a decade. The specific contracts they used are long obsolete. The men who designed this system are long dead. But the impulse that drove them, the desire to control, to profit from others' labor, to maintain hierarchies of power, that impulse did not die. What the ledger teaches us is not just history. It teaches us to recognize patterns, to look beneath surface legality to practical reality, to understand that oppression adapts, taking new forms when old forms are prohibited. The ledger is a warning as much as a historical record. It warns us that noble words on paper, whether emancipation proclamations or constitutional amendments, mean nothing without enforcement and vigilance. It warns us that those who benefit from injustice will seek ways to continue it under new names. It warns us that freedom is not a gift given once, but a condition that must be constantly defended and expanded. The ledger itself, the physical object, bears marks of its history. The black leather cover is worn smooth in places where hands held it. The spine is cracked from being opened repeatedly. The pages are slightly wavy, suggesting exposure to humidity during its decades hidden in Mississippi. Forensic analysis conducted in the 1970s revealed interesting details. The ink used throughout was consistent, suggesting a single writer, almost certainly Robert Garrett himself, made all the entries. The handwriting showed no signs of deterioration over the 8 years of entries, indicating Garrett maintained steady health during this period. The paper quality was high, better than typical business ledgers of the era. This suggested the ledger was created specifically for this purpose, not improvised from available materials. Someone, probably Garrett, had acquired fine paper and had it bound in plain black leather without identifying marks. The ledger was designed from the start to be secret. The false compartment in the larger ledger that hid the secret book was skillfully constructed. The wooden backing had been carefully hollowed out, lined with felt to prevent the hidden book from rattling, and sealed so that the modification was nearly undetectable. This wasn't hasty concealment, this was planned, deliberate hiding with the expectation that the ledger might need to remain hidden for a very long time. Conservation experts who examined the ledger noted that if it had remained in its hiding place much longer, it might have been destroyed. The humidity in Mississippi, the lack of air circulation in the sealed compartment, the acids in the leather and paper, all were slowly degrading the document. Another decade or two, and the ledger might have become illegible or disintegrated entirely. Thomas sometimes thought about this during his years at Yale, the contingency of it all. If he had catalogued the crates in a different order, he might have set that particular ledger aside and never returned to it. If he hadn't noticed the slight thickness of the spine, if he hadn't investigated further, if he had been less curious or more tired that particular Friday, the ledger might have remained hidden. The truth might have stayed buried. Sarah Miller and Marcus Davis and Hannah Travis and all the others would have remained names in documents that no one connected to a larger system. History, Thomas realized, was full of such contingencies. How many other secret ledgers remained hidden? How many other systems operated without leaving such clear documentation? How much of the past remained unknown because the evidence was successfully concealed or destroyed? The survival of this one ledger and its discovery was in some ways a matter of luck, but Thomas preferred to think of it as something else. A small victory for truth over concealment, for memory over forgetting, for the voices of the exploited over the desires of the exploiters to hide their actions. Thomas Whitfield died in February 1994 at age 70 from complications of pneumonia. He had remained professionally active until the end, still publishing, still lecturing, still mentoring graduate students, researching various aspects of exploitation and resistance. His funeral was attended by family, colleagues, former students, and several descendants of people whose names appeared in the ledger. Ellen read one of Dorothy Carter's letters during the service, the one thanking Thomas for proving her grandmother's suffering was real. Among Thomas's papers, his family found a journal entry from 1952, written shortly after he discovered the secret ledger. It read, "I don't know yet what I've found, not fully, but I know it's significant. I know it's evidence of something terrible, something that was deliberately hidden. Part of me wishes I hadn't found it, because now that I know, I can't unknow. Now that I've seen these names, these codes, I have a responsibility to them. Sarah M., Joseph K., Hannah T. They were real people. They lived and suffered and died, and someone reduced them to initials and codes and monetary values. Someone hid the record of what was done to them. I don't know if I'm the right person to bring this to light. I'm young, relatively inexperienced, probably naive about how difficult this will be, but I'm the person who found it, so I guess I'm the person who has to do something about it. I think history is a kind of resurrection. We can't bring these people back to life. We can't undo what was done to them, but we can remember them. We can tell their stories. We can refuse to let them be forgotten. That's what I'm going to do, whatever it costs." Ellen, reading this entry after Thomas's death, wept, because she knew what it had cost. The career disruption, the threats, the years of controversy and criticism, the toll of spending a lifetime immersed in documentation of human suffering. But she also knew what it had achieved. The truth revealed, the stories told, the contribution to historical understanding, the impact on people like Dorothy Carter, who finally had answers to questions they'd carried for years. At the memorial service held at Yale, Professor Eleanor Wright, now elderly herself, one of the first scholars who had examined the ledger in 1952, spoke about Thomas's legacy. Thomas Whitfield changed how we understand Reconstruction. Before his discovery of the Delta Agricultural Preservation Society ledger, we knew that the post-war period was difficult for freed people. We knew there was exploitation, but Thomas showed us the systematic nature of it, the organization, the deliberate design. He showed us that this wasn't just economic hardship or social prejudice. It was calculated, coordinated oppression. But more than that, Thomas showed us what it means to be a historian. It means having the courage to reveal uncomfortable truths. It means giving voice to the voiceless. It means persisting even when powerful interests want you to stop. It means understanding that history isn't just about the past. It's about how we understand ourselves and our society in the present. The ledger still exists. The evidence is still there. Future generations will continue to study it, to learn from it, to grapple with what it reveals. That's Thomas's legacy. Not just the discovery, but the commitment to truth that drove him to share it despite the costs. The plantation where Robert Garrett operated his part of the network no longer exists as such. The land was subdivided over the years, sold off piece by piece. The main house burned down in 1967. Some said arson, others claimed faulty wiring. No one was ever charged. The land was eventually developed into housing subdivisions and commercial property. Nothing remains of the physical plantation except some property markers, a few old foundations visible in overgrown lots, and faded photographs in archives. The world that the ledger documented has vanished, but the ledger remains. It sits in its climate-controlled vault in Washington, D.C., though a small black book that contains multitudes, 50 pages documenting 8 years during which thousands of people were trapped in a system designed to circumvent their freedom. Researchers still request access to it. Students still write papers about it. It appears in textbooks and documentaries. It exists now in digital form, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The codes have all been deciphered, the names identified, the system exposed in exhaustive detail. Yet in some ways, it remains mysterious. The human stories behind each entry, what Sarah Miller thought when she signed her contract, what Marcus Davis felt standing in that courthouse, what Hannah Travis told herself to endure year after year, those internal experiences are lost to history. The ledger documents actions and outcomes, but not feelings and thoughts. We know what happened to these people. We don't fully know what it was like to be them. And that gap between historical documentation and lived experience is perhaps the ledger's final lesson. We can study the past. We can excavate its evidence. We can reveal its secrets. But we can never fully reclaim what was lost. We can only remember and learn and commit ourselves to ensuring that such systems never operate again. The families whose ancestors were exploited under this system have scattered across the country over generations. Many don't know their connection to those names in the ledger. Some do know and have done their own research, tracing family lines back to Mississippi plantations, piecing together stories from fragments. The families whose ancestors operated the system also live on, mostly unaware of or uncomfortable with their historical connection. A few have engaged seriously with this history, acknowledging it and working to address its ongoing impacts. The system itself, the Delta Agricultural Preservation Society, the network of plantation owners, the coded ledgers and restrictive contracts, all of that ended in the 1870s. But its echoes persist in structures and patterns that evolved from it. Sharecropping, convict leasing, debt peonage, mass incarceration, each with its own specific mechanisms, each part of a longer history of finding ways to control and exploit those with less power. The ledger bears witness to one chapter in that history. It proves that abolition on paper didn't mean abolition in practice. It documents how systems adapt, how oppression takes new forms, how freedom must be not just declared, but actively defended. And it reminds us that truth, even truth that is buried and hidden, can be revealed. That documents kept secret for decades can come to light. That voices silenced in their lifetimes can speak to us across the years if we're willing to listen. The ledger exists. It waits in its vault for the next researcher, the next generation of students, the next person trying to understand how injustice works and how it must be opposed. It has survived, against odds, despite efforts to conceal it. And in surviving, it has ensured that the people it documents are not forgotten. Sarah M., Joseph K., Hannah T., Marcus D., Elizabeth R. All the names, all the codes, all the stories, they remain. Not just as entries in a hidden ledger finally brought to light, but as human beings whose experiences, whose suffering, whose resistance to a system designed to trap them. All of that becomes part of our collective memory when we choose to remember rather than forget. That choice, to remember, to face difficult truths, to learn from history rather than bury it, that's what Thomas Whitfield fought for. That's what the ledger, in its continued existence, demands of us. The past is never truly past. It shapes the present in ways we often don't recognize. Documents like the ledger help us see those connections, understand those patterns, and hopefully build something better. The work continues.